Hello, everybody. Welcome to Brandon's Haunted Library. My name is Brandon, your undead librarian, and I read and talk about fantasy, literary fiction, and of course, horror. Thank you for choosing my video. Today, we're going to be counting down my top 25 favorite horror reads from 2025 of the nearly 50 horror books I read this past year. I read a lot of really good stuff, and I was surprised at what novels fell short of my top 25. So this year I wanted to quickly shout out a few honorable mentions. Those are Play Nice by Rachel Harrison, The Possession of Alba Diaz by Isabel Cañas, The Troop by Nick Cutter, and Certain Dark Things by Silvia Moreno Garcia. All were really incredible, but just came short of the top 25, but I still wanted to recognize them. Now let's kick off the countdown at 25 with Private Rights, a haunting and beautifully restrained near-future apocalypse from Julia Armfield. Set in a world slowly drowning under endless rain and flooding, the novel captures a quiet end-of-days atmosphere where society hasn't fully collapsed, but everyone seems to know it eventually will. And yet, life goes on. People work, argue, love, and endure as the world erodes around them. The story centers on three estranged sisters brought back together by the death of their father, a renowned architect who designed their family's glass house to withstand the climate disaster outside. One of the novel's most striking elements is its interludes narrated by the city itself, a collective voice observing how urban life persists amid ruin. With lyrical prose and subtle horror woven throughout, Armfield explores grief, distance, love, and resignation in a slow burn apocalypse that lingers long after the final pages. Coming in at number 24 is Coup de Grace, an unforgettable debut horror novella from Sophia Arjam that unfolds almost entirely within the Montreal subway system. Told in the first person, the story follows a suicidal man whose subway commute takes a surreal turn when he discovers there are no exits, no turning turnstiles, no departing trains, only endless underground corridors. What follows is a claustrophobic psychological descent as he wanders for days through a space that feels both infinite and crushingly enclosed. The novella reads like a fever dream, strange, literary, and deeply unsettling, filled with disturbing imagery that lingers. At the same time, it's a raw and thoughtful exploration of depression and suicidal ideation, bringing readers uncomfortably close to a fractured inner life. With sharp, distinctive prose and a bold narrative voice, this is an impressive and fearless debut that announces Sophia Arjam as a writer to watch. At number 23 is another debut. The Lamb by Lucy Rose is a dark, lyrical, coming-of-age novel that fully lives up to its reputation. Told in a haunting fairy tale-like voice, the story follows Margot, a young girl raised in an isolated woodland cottage by her mother, a serial-killing cannibal who feeds them by welcoming lost strangers to their door. What makes this novel so striking is Lucy Rose's hypnotic prose, which creates an atmosphere that is both enchanting and deeply unsettling. The violence is visceral and unforgettable, but never empty. Cannibalism becomes a powerful metaphor for love, grief, dependence, and the way devotion can turn consuming. At its heart, this is a devastating portrait of a child shaped by an all-encompassing, dangerous parent. Strange and emotionally bruising, The Lamb is a gorgeously written horror novel that lingers long after you finish. At number 22 is Lucky Day by Chuck Tingle, a novel that completely surprised me and might be my favorite thing he's written so far. Tingle leads hard into absurdity with this one, delivering outrageous, over-the-top death scenes with strong Final Destination energy, but beneath the chaos is a story grappling with nihilism, randomness, existential dread, and the erasure of bisexual identity. The novel follows Vera, a former statistics professor who is a survivor of a global catastrophe known as the low probability event, an incident that leaves her emotionally hollow after it resulted in the loss of her mother. Years later, she's pulled into an investigation surrounding a suspiciously lucky Las Vegas casino where probability itself seems broken. What starts as a strange mystery escalates into bold, unexpected cosmic horror, all filtered through Tingle's self-aware, wildly inventive voice. It's chaotic, hilarious, unsettling, and surprisingly thoughtful. At number 21 is Let the Right One In by John Lindquist, a haunting and deeply human vampire novel. Set in a bleak 1980s suburb of Stockholm, the story follows Oscar, a lonely and bullied 12-year-old whose life changes when he befriends Ellie, a mysterious child who only appears at night. And while it's undeniably a vampire story, its true power lies in how it explores loneliness, abuse, alienation, and the quiet cruelty of everyday life. Lindquist uses horror to examine the darkest corners of humanity, building an atmosphere that is tense, brutal, and emotionally devastating. The novel also offers a chilling portrayal on what it means to become a vampire, the loss of control, the hunger, and moral cost of survival. Tender, horrifying in equal measures, this is a profoundly original and unforgettable take on vampire fiction. At number 20 is When Darkness Loves Us by Elizabeth Engstrom, a rediscovered horror gem from Valancourt and Grady Hendrix's Paperbacks from Hell series that absolutely earns its cult reputation. This collection includes two novellas, When Darkness Loves Us and Beauty Is, and together they showcase Engstrom's uncanny ability to blend raw emotion with deeply unsettling horror. The title story is a masterclass in claustrophobic terror, creating an overwhelming sense of dread almost entirely through its atmosphere and darkness, with twists that are shocking and unforgettable. The story, Beauty Is, shifts into something more tragic and intimate, telling a heartbreaking story of isolation and cruelty with surprising tenderness. Across both novellas, Engstrom's prose is lyrical, strange, and haunting, balancing beauty and horror in a way that feels timeless. These are short, devastating nightmares that lingered with me long after finishing. At number 19 is Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor, a relentless and unflinching novel that reads like a literary hurricane. Set in a small rural village in Mexico, the story begins with the discovery of a corpse of a woman known as the Witch, and unfolds through the interwoven perspectives of the villagers who knew her. Each voice exposes layers of poverty, misogyny, addiction, and human cruelty, painting a portrait of a community both vivid and devastating. Melchor's prose, masterfully translated by Sophie Hughes, mirrors the chaos of the narrative with long, unbroken sentences and a relentless rhythm. This is horror grounded in reality, brutal and immersive, capturing the dark heart of human behavior. Intense, exhausting, and astonishingly written, Hurricane Season is a modern Mexican masterpiece. At number 18 is Bat Eaters and Other Names for Cora Zhang by Kylie Lee Baker, a ferocious horror novel set in the 2020 pandemic, blending a serial killer plot, Chinese folklore, and incisive social commentary. Cora Zhang works as a crime scene cleaner in New York City, washing away the remnants of brutal murders and suicides, and can't help but notice all of her recent cleanups have been murders of East Asian women, and strangely there are bat carcasses found at all of the crime scenes. In addition, Cora begins feeling a supernatural presence tied to Chinese folklore as her and her fellow crime scene cleaners try to understand what's happening to all these women. The novel confronts the surge of hostility and violence against Asian American women during the COVID pandemic head on without ever feeling heavy handed in its commentary. With its creepy atmosphere, moments of squelchy, visceral gore, and a strong ensemble cast, this is an angry, haunting, and incredibly powerful horror story. I haven't done a full review for this one yet since I only read this a few days ago, so subscribe if you want to hear me go in more depth in my next wrap up. At number 17, Victorian Psycho by Virginia Feito is one of the most unhinged and memorable horror novellas I read this year. Winifred Naughty arrives at Ensor House as a seemingly proper Victorian governess. She tutors two children, reads them bedtime stories, and casually jokes, at least internally, about eating them. As Christmas approaches, the strain of repressing the horrid compulsions of her past becomes unbearable, and the novel barrels towards a spectacularly grim finale. Feito's greatest strength is Winifred's inner monologue, wildly off the rails, razor sharp, and laugh out loud funny. The prose mimics Victorian sensibilities and even breaks the fourth wall to address the reader, a la Charlotte Bronte, yet it never feels pretentious or forced. Instead, it's dark comedy colliding with gothic horror, delivered with casual brutality and even wit. If this book makes you laugh, you're absolutely my kind of people. At number 16 is Horror Movie by Paul Tremblay, a daring and deeply unsettling twist on the cursed film genre. The novel revolves around the attempted remake of an infamous horror movie from 1993 that was never completed after a series of traumatic, mysterious events during its filming. The story is told by the sole surviving member of the original production, an unreliable and obsessive narrator who played the Thin Kid, the slasher villain of the film. Told through a fragmented puzzle-like structure that jumps around timelines and includes sections of the film's original script, the book slowly blurs the line between the movie and real life. As it builds, the story becomes increasingly disturbing, tense, and gory. With its meta-horror, Tremblay explores fear, horror fandom, capitalism, bullying, and teenage alienation in ways that feel both clever and unnerving. Experimental, immersive, and haunting, this was a memorable reading experience for me. At number 15, The Great and Secret Show by Clive Barker is one of those novels that is so strange in scope and ambition that it's genuinely difficult to explain what it's about. So let's let the book summary speak for itself. Armageddon begins with a murder in the Dead Letters office in Omaha. A lake that has never existed falls from the clouds over Paloma Grove, California. Young passion blossoms as the world withers with war. The great and secret show has begun on the stage of the world. Soon the final curtain must fall. This is a weird one, and I fully expect some of you to question my taste for ranking it so high if you do decide to read it. There's a lot of shock value horror here that I wouldn't normally enjoy, yes, including monsters made of literal fecal matter, and I won't even get into how they come to life, but Clive Barker has a way of pulling it off for me. The imagination on display here is impressive, and the sheer scope of world building makes this massive tome incredibly rewarding to finish. The cast is large but well developed, with Tesla standing out as a fantastic heroine. When the book came out in the late 80s, David Foster Wallace famously dismissed it as a Manichean soap opera, calling it pretentious beyond belief and derivative of The Stand and Blue Velvet. I bring that up partially because it makes me laugh coming from him, and partially because those King and Lynch comparisons actually help explain why I love it so much. But it's also so distinctly Clive Barker that those comparisons fall short. I haven't done a full review yet on my channel, but I'm excited to dive deeper in my next wrap-up video. At number 14 is Mayfly by CJ Leede, a bold borderline splatterpunk debut that delivers an unforgettable character study drenched in sex, violence, and Los Angeles grit. The novel follows Maeve, an unhinged and deeply disturbed woman who spends her days working at Disneyland as an Elsa impersonator, and her nights in the city's dive bars for nights of debauchery. For me, the plot takes a backseat to Maeve's voice as the story tracks her descent from intrusive urges to full-blown homicidal madness. Written in first person, the prose alternates between poetic introspection and shockingly obscene brutality, creating a hypnotic and unsettling rhythm. Drawing clear inspiration from American Psycho, the novel interrogates society's obsession with explaining violence, using Maeve's indifferent cruelty to challenge gendered assumptions on rage. Extreme, absurd, and darkly compelling, Mayfly is a wild ride. At number 13 is Slewfoot by Brom, a richly imagined work of folk horror set in 17th century New England. The novel follows Abatha, a young Englishwoman trapped in a rigid Puritan community after her husband's sudden death leaves her vulnerable to exploitation and suspicion from the community. Abatha forms a strange bond with a forest demon. Brom excels at creating atmosphere with the oppressive isolation of the setting. What truly sets Slewfoot apart is its willingness to fully embody its darkness, bringing its supernatural elements vividly to life through brutal imagery and dark fairy tale sensibility. The novel explores religious repression, patriarchal control, and female liberation with ferocity and heart, making it a great folk horror experience. At number 12 is Natural Beauty by Lingling Huang, a strange, haunting, sharply satirical horror novel that I absolutely loved. The story follows an unnamed narrator, a once promising pianist whose life is derailed by family tragedy, pushing her into a job at Holistic, an elite wellness and beauty brand catering to the ultra-wealthy. What initially seemed like a dream opportunity slowly reveals something far more disturbing beneath its glossy surface. Huang brilliantly blends elegant lyrical prose with moments of grotesque and inventive body horror, making each unsettling turn even more jarring. The novel delivers pointed social commentary on the wellness industry and our obsession with optimizing the body while also exploring beauty through the lenses of race and class. Bold, weird, and imaginative, Natural Beauty is a thought-provoking critique of the beauty industry and a really entertaining horror read. At number 11 is House of Bone and Rain by Gabino Iglesias, a powerful and emotionally devastating blend of crime, coming of age, and supernatural horror. Set in Puerto Rico, The novel follows 5 teenage boys whose lives are shattered when one of their mothers is murdered in an act of gang violence. As they pursue vengeance in the criminal underworld, a massive hurricane hits the island, and in their culture, storms are said to carry evil spirits ashore. Iglesias masterfully blurs gritty realism with the supernatural, creating a story that feels raw and haunting. The characters are beautifully crafted and deeply empathetic, their choices feeling painfully authentic as the plot escalates. Written in lush, vivid prose, the novel captures both the physical destruction of the hurricane and the emotional wreckage left behind. Violent, bloody, and heartbreakingly human, this is a stunning showcase of Iglesias' storytelling power. And now, kicking off my top 10 is Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, a Gothic classic I finally picked up this year. Published in 1872, 25 years before Dracula, this novella makes it impossible to overstate how foundational 19th century Gothic literature is to modern horror. While I don't consider myself an expert on the genre's history, I'm very much a fan, and Carmilla stands out as some of the most impressive Gothic prose that I've read. The story follows Laura, a young woman living in an isolated Austrian castle with her father. As a child, she experiences a disturbing vision of a beautiful woman who bites her. Years later, after a mysterious carriage accident, a guest named Carmilla is taken in. Laura quickly realizes she's the woman from that long ago apparition. As the two grow closer, a charged and yearning attraction develops between them, while strange deaths plague the surrounding countryside and Laura is haunted by visions. Le Fanu's atmosphere is exquisite, heavy with melancholy, dread, and sensuality. The depiction of lesbian desire is strikingly bold, especially given the sexual repression of the era. Yet it's handled with such elegance and restraint that the novella never slips into exploitation. Instead, it feels culturally groundbreaking, seductive, and deeply unsettling all at once. What impressed me most is how much power and influence Carmilla packs into such a short work. The eroticism, the gothic gloom, and the sense of creeping inevitability all coexist, making this far more than a historical artifact. It's a sophisticated, haunting vampire story that still resonates today. And now, number 9, Cujo by Stephen King, a novel I read for the first time this year, and it was one that completely floored me. Set in Castle Rock, Maine, this is one of King's most iconic stories, but there's so much depth and ambition that lives beneath its brutal premise. On the surface, it's a nightmare scenario. A beloved St. Bernard contracts rabies and traps a mother and her young son in a broken down car during a heat wave. But Cujo is so much more than a survival horror. Stripped of its most horrific elements, it's a devastating family drama about infidelity, restraint, and guilt, and people quietly falling apart. The tension is relentless, with the novel unfolding in a suffocating rush that makes you feel every degree of heat and every second ticking by. King's choice to include moments from Cujo's perspective is especially heartbreaking, reframing the dog from monster into victim as disease slowly overtakes his mind. What makes the book so powerful is that there's no supernatural evil at work here, just coincidence, neglect, and a terrifyingly real illness. That grounded realism is where King truly shines in my eyes, crafting horror that feels possible, intimate, and deeply human. Brutal, tragic, and unforgettable, Cujo earns its place among my favorite Stephen King novels. At number 8, The Between by Tananarive Due, her 1995 debut novel, and a powerful reminder of just how underappreciated her work still is. Due is a foundational voice in horror and speculative fiction, and this novel showcases her remarkable ability to craft character-driven stories that are emotionally complex and quietly unsettling. The story follows Hilton and his wife Dee Dee, a successful couple raising 2 children in Miami. She newly appointed as the first black judge in her circuit, him working as a social worker at a drug rehab clinic. Their lives begin to unravel when Dee Dee receives racist threats and Hilton is plagued by increasingly vivid nightmares he can no longer separate from waking life. What makes The Between so effective is its ambiguity. The horror unfolds gradually, hovering between psychological breakdown and possible supernatural influence, with Due constantly inviting the reader to question what's real. Hilton is a deeply flawed, painfully human protagonist, and reading the novel feels like witnessing a prolonged nervous breakdown from the inside. Through his stubborn refusal to seek help, Due explores masculinity, fatherhood, and the quiet damage caused by mistaking isolation for strength. Seem, Themes of racism, mental illness, marriage, and grief are also woven seamlessly into the narrative. The Between remains strikingly relevant decades later and stands as an astonishing debut from a true master of the genre. At number 7 is The Bewitching by Sylvia Moreno Garcia, a novel that reaffirmed why she's an author I trust completely. From the opening pages, Moreno Garcia's command of history, folklore, and atmosphere is unmistakable. The story unfolds across three distinct timelines, and while the shifting perspective and years ask for some patience early on, the payoff is immense once everything clicks. What emerges is a slow-burning, intricately structured tale where witchcraft, superstition, and buried secrets echo across generations. The novel's modern storyline follows Minerva, a graduate student in the 1990s researching the disappearance of a young woman in the 1930s, and the life of horror writer Beatrice Tremblay. These chapters, steeped in archives and academic investigation, were my favorite, especially in how they quietly interrogate horror's place in literary spaces that often dismiss it. Beatrice's own diary entries from the 1930s deepens the mystery, blurring reality and supernatural as her account grows increasingly unsettling, and the earliest timeline, set in rural Mexico in 1908, leans fully into folk horror, superstition, and whispered tales of witches haunting the land. Individually, each narrative is compelling and haunting, and as the story converges, The Bewitching reveals itself as an elegant, eerie meditation on fear, memory, and how belief persists. It's a beautifully constructed novel that lives up to Moreno Garcia's remarkable body of work. At number 6 is The Lesser Dead by Christopher Buehlman, a viciously fun and unforgettable vampire novel set in the underground subways of 1978 New York City. The story is told by Joey Peacock, a teenage vampire who spent decades haunting subway tunnels and nightlife scenes, feeding in punk clubs, chasing thrills, and living with a hidden community of the undead beneath the city. Joey is an unreliable narrator with a sharp sense of humor and a strong New York voice, unfiltered, charismatic, and constantly breaking the fourth wall in ways that make his story feel intimate and entertaining. What begins as a wild, blood-soaked tour of the city's underground takes a sharp turn when Joey encounters a group of vampire children on the subway, an event that completely reshapes the story. From there, the novel plays expertly with the reader's expectations as stakes rise. Buehlman balances humor and horror with ease, delivering vivid characters and a non-stop sense of momentum. The nonlinear structure keeps the reader off balance, and when the final act hits, the book becomes brutal, fast, and genuinely shocking. Gory, clever, and deeply engaging, The Lesser Dead is a modern vampire story that's as funny as it is terrifying, and nearly impossible to put down. At number 5 is When the Wolf Comes Home by Nat Cassidy. Going in, I already really admired Cassidy's previous work, but this book completely floored me with its emotional depth, relentless pacing, and wildly inventive reimagining of the werewolf story. The novel follows Jessa, a struggling actress who crosses paths with a runaway child after a violent encounter with his father. What begins as a desperate escape quickly spirals into a nightmare of shape-shifting horror, generational trauma, and fear. This is an absolute page-turner, constantly twisting and subverting expectations while maintaining an intense sense of momentum. The violence is brutal and vividly portrayed, but what truly anchors the story are its characters. Cassidy uses werewolf mythos to explore inherited fear, fractured families, and the differences in terror that exist in childhood and adulthood. The portrayal of strained father-son relationships is especially powerful, and the emotional gut punches, particularly in its cathartic ending, hit hard. Wild, scary, funny, and heartbreaking, this is a werewolf novel unlike anything I've read. At number 4 is The Stand by Stephen King, a monumental apocalyptic epic that fully earns its reputation as his most ambitious novel. I read the complete uncut edition, and the sheer scope of what King attempts here is staggering, from its massive cast of characters to the moral, philosophical, and theological questions at its core. The story opens with the accidental release of Captain Trips, a government-engineered superflu that wipes out 99% of humanity. The first section is easily my favorite, unfolding like a series of chilling horror vignettes as civilization collapses. King lingers on haunting images of abandoned towns, silent highways, and systemic cruelty from government cover-ups to soldiers enforcing control through violence. It feels disturbingly real and utterly terrifying. As the novel progresses, the focus shifts from survival to reconstruction and ideology. The second section slows down, but it's rich with questions about democracy, leadership, and how fragile social order really is. By the time the story reaches its final act, the conflict has grown biblical in scale, with clear echoes of Armageddon, Mother Abigail as prophet, Randall Flagg as a devil figure, and humanity caught between faith, fear, and free will. Even if the ending doesn't land perfectly for everyone, the journey is unforgettable. The Stand is a sprawling, deeply human exploration of who we are at our best and worst, and one of Stephen King's greatest achievements. At number 3 is Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield, a haunting, intimate novel that blends literary fiction, horror, and magical realism in a way that's both mesmerizing and emotionally devastating. The story follows Miri and her wife Leah. Leah, a marine biologist that goes on a deep sea submarine expedition that goes horribly wrong, and when she returns home, she is not the same. The narrative alternates between Miri's perspective, grappling with the aftermath of Leah's return and trying to reconnect with her, and Leah's account of the mysterious events that unfolds from the depths of the ocean. Armfield's slow unraveling of the story creates a deeply immersive experience where tension builds alongside grief and longing. What truly elevates this book is how Armfield fuses horror with a deeply human relationship drama. Miri and Leah's marriage forms the emotional center, portrayed with tenderness and nuance and realism. The ocean itself becomes a character, terrifying, unknowable, and beautiful. The deeper the story dives, the more unsettling it becomes, reflecting the unknowable depths of grief and mysterious transformations of the human heart. Armfield's prose is exquisite, rich with water imagery and metaphors that mirrors the novel's structure as sections progress through increasingly deep oceanic depths. While the novel contains tense, unsettling moments aboard the submarine, its focus remains on atmosphere and the slow burn emotional horror. Ambiguity is key, leaving questions unanswered in a way that mirrors the incomprehensible depths of both the sea and the character's experience. Our Wives Under the Sea is a beautiful, eerie, and devastating exploration of love, loss, and the unknown. At number 2 is The Dead Zone by Stephen King, a novel that masterfully blends horror with a deeply human story about loss, fate, and moral responsibility. The story follows Johnny Smith, a schoolteacher whose life is forever altered after a catastrophic car accident leaves him in a coma for over 4 years. Upon waking, Johnny discovers he possesses a psychic ability, the power to glimpse moments from people's past and future through touch. This gift isolates him, forcing him to navigate the unbearable burden of knowing what might come and to confront difficult choices that weigh heavily on his conscience. What sets this novel apart is how grounded and emotionally resonant King makes Johnny's experience. The horror doesn't come solely from his psychic visions, but from the loneliness, alienation, and moral dilemmas he faces as he struggles to reintegrate into a world that has moved on without him. The human stakes are elevated by Greg Stilson, a rising politician whose violent charisma and populist rage makes him a terrifying villain precisely because he is convincingly real. King balances tight pacing, rich character development, and a psychological tension with moments of supernatural intrigue. The novel explores how fear, manipulation, and self-interest can ripple through communities, while also probing the ethical limits of knowing the future and taking action. The Dead Zone is suspenseful, heartbreaking, and morally complex, a perfect example of Stephen King's ability to craft horror that resonates long after its final pages. And my favorite horror novel of the year is The Buffalo Hunter Hunter by Stephen Graham Jones, a remarkable and devastating work that cements him as one of the modern masters of horror. This novel is an ambitious blend of historical fiction and supernatural horror, centering on a vampire of the Blackfeet tribe in the American West. Its backdrop is the horrifying and often overlooked Marias Massacre of 1870, in which the U.S. Army slaughtered over 200 Piegan Blackfeet, mostly women and children. This real historical atrocity drives the novel's dark narrative, giving the horror an emotional and ethical weight that lingers long after the story ends. Jones tells the story in a fragmented epistolary style reminiscent of Bram Stoker's Dracula, alternating between the diary of a Lutheran priest named Arthur Bucharn in 1912 and later entries from his great-great-granddaughter Etsy Bucharn. The narrative also features the chilling confessions of a mysterious Blackfoot named Goodstab, whose story unfolds in unpredictable, often horrifying ways. Each perspective is distinct and compelling, particularly that of Goodstab's. What makes this novel exceptional is Jones's ability to juxtapose supernatural terror with real human atrocities. The vampire lore is inventive and terrifying, and it serves to complement the horror of the historical events, making the brutality of US colonial violence as the more poignant. The church scenes, with their escalating tension, are truly terrifying, while the narrative structure draws you into an intimate investigation of memory, trauma, and vengeance. The Buffalo Hunter is brutal, haunting, and masterfully written, and my favorite horror book of 2025. And that's my top 20 horror reads of the year. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it all the way to the end of this video. It really means a lot to me. And because you stuck around, I'm going to show you my list of my favorite horror movies released this year, because it was an incredible year in horror cinema as well. And I also added a link to a Spotify playlist I made, including new music that I love from this year. So check that too if that's interesting to you. I also wanted to take a moment to thank everyone who supported me during my first complete year on BookTube. When I started this channel, I wasn't sure if it was something I'd stick with, but the incredible community and seeing all your comments and encouragement has continued to make such a rewarding experience. I've got some exciting videos and great books on my TBR for the coming year, and I'm so looking forward to sharing them with you. Thank you again for your support, and here's to another year of spooky reads and thoughtful discussion. Until next time, stay spooky and Happy New Year's.